to doing the people's business, and in doing so in such a way that matters to everyday Americans. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the gentleman said that there's a risk of information being taken from the healthcare.gov site. There's a potential risk from any site, but every day there are tens of thousands of American identities being stolen because of this body's refusal to simply fix our broken immigration system now. Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as she may consume to the gentlewoman from New York, the ranking member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Slaughter.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the majority has passed so few bills into law that it is on pace to become the least productive Congress in history, and frankly, I think they're a little proud of that. The inability to govern is directly related to the closed legislative process the majority has pursued with vigor over the course of the last year. At the beginning here of the second session of the 113th Congress, the majority has practically shuttered the doors of every committee, save for the Rules Committee. It is a rare day when a bill proceeds through regular order from a committee of jurisdiction to the Rules Committee and down to the House floor. In fact, during the first session of the 113th Congress, major legislation repeatedly originated in the Rules Committee and was rushed to the House floor for an up or down vote. Furthermore, during the first congressional session, the majority relied upon closed rules to shut out the minority and diminish the chance of any compromise. Under a closed rule, no amendments are allowed on the House floor. That cuts out, Mr. Speaker, more than half of the people in the United States of America who voted for Democrats. During 2013, the majority set new records by approving 19 closed rules in a single week and an unprecedented 11 closed rules in a single day. Even those with no interest in or knowledge of legislative process can understand the impact that closed process has on our ability to govern. Every member of this chamber was sent here with a simple duty: to represent our constituents to the best of our ability. But by closing down the legislative process, the majority is preventing 200 duly elected members of Congress from being able to do just that. Collectively, we members of the minority represent more than 142 million Americans, each one of us entrusted to work on their behalf. How can we do that when the majority takes away our ability to participate in marking up legislation, amending bills, and having a full and open debate? The Rules Committee has the unique and powerful ability to open up the legislative process and get Congress working again. In our committee, we can amend bills, improve legislation, set the terms of debate so every member of the House can participate in the legislative process. And that is why I am so dismayed and somewhat disgusted at the proposed rule the majority in the Rules Committee has carried to the floor today. Before us is a single resolution for 3 bills. Under this resolution, 2 of those bills are considered under closed rules, which are not amendable, not discussable, and 1 is considered under a structured rule. And that one came up 2 days ago, has had no committee action whatever. Now, the bill being considered under a structured rule tries to revoke virtually all the regulation powers from the EPA, the agency that protects our health, our rivers, our air, and our land. At the same time, one of the bills being considered under the closed rule adds layers of red tape to the Department of Health and Human Services and demands that health care navigators provide everything to the public except their blood type and their family history to Congress on an almost daily basis. It is simply designed to slow up the work of signing up Americans for the health care that they want and deserve. It's very clear this bill is not a serious attempt to serve the American people, but is a tactic to keep health care navigators from doing their work. Instead of moving forward with these go-nowhere bills, we should be extending unemployment insurance to the millions of Americans struggling to find work, and without that unemployment insurance, the economy is suffering every single day. Now, just before we left for Christmas, the last day we were here, and the debate on the rule of the budget, we had a vote that we could have done to extend the unemployment during the rules debate on the floor. That was under the previous question. The vote failed despite the fact that every Democrat and a Republican voted for it. And as a result, now, by the way, this bill was paid for, already taken care of by excess payments that we pay in agricultural subsidies. It was an extension for 3 months, but that was not good enough. So today you're going to have another chance to do just that, to extend the unemployment insurance, and I strongly urge my colleagues to do it. If my colleagues will join me in voting no on the previous question, a 3-month extension of unemployment benefits will come to the floor for an immediate vote. This is the same bipartisan bill moving forward in the Senate, deserves the same consideration here in the House. Today, more than 1.3 million Americans have lost access, not only 1.3 Americans and their families, to the unemployment insurance. Soon it will be over 2 million, and by probably the end of March or May, 5 million. For so many, it's their only source of income and the only way they can pay their heating bills and buy food during these cold winter days. We've got to stand up for the millions of Americans struggling to get by through no fault of their own, because you remember that in order to be eligible for unemployment insurance, you have to prove that you are looking for work. So I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question when it comes up, so that we can have an immediate vote to extend unemployment insurance and finally do something in this House and through this Rules Committee that will benefit the Americans and make our constituents know that we count for something. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the time remaining? May I inquire as to the time remaining?
Texas has 16 minutes. The gentleman from Texas has 16 minutes. And the gentleman from Colorado has 13 minutes.
Very well, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's often said those who don't remember their history are doomed to repeat it. The Rules Committee is an important function of this House, an important function of this body. 3 years ago, prior to 3 years ago, the Rules Committee was under the jurisdiction of the Democrats. They controlled the Rules Committee throughout the entirety of the 111th Congress. You may recall that was the first 2 years of the first Obama term. In those 2 years, under Speaker Pelosi, this was the first Congress in history, the first Congress in the history of the Republic not to have a single bill considered under an open rule process. Now, since Republicans resumed the majority at the beginning of 2011, 31 bills have come under an open rule. Track record may not be perfect, but it is inestimably better than what preceded it. I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Colorado, record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nevertheless, I would remind the gentleman, Mr. Burgess, that this particular rule has 2 closed rules on 2 of the 3 bills. With that, I'll yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Has to address the House, unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I want to join the Rules Committee and thank members on both sides of the aisle for their hard work. But I want to associate myself with Ranking Member Slaughter for recognizing that we represent millions of people, and the constant closed rule approach or bills that have not even been heard by committee makes it difficult to represent your constituents. So I associate myself with her plea for equity and comity, and I also ask that we recognize that 1.3 million and growing to 3.6 million, 4,000 a week, of the individuals who worked and invested in this nation have received letters, like my constituent in Houston, letters with no offer of assistance, but simply that your unemployment benefit, insurance benefit has been canceled. Cancel your life, cancel your housing, cancel your food, cancel your medicine, cancel taking care of your children, cancel your life. And so I believe it is extremely important that we vote today again, and we hope that we will draw bipartisan support to avoid the loss of some 200,000 jobs, to avoid the loss of serving 20,000 military veterans who are, in fact, beneficiaries of unemployment insurance, 1.3 million Americans, 2 million children impacted, to avoid the loss to the American economy. $1.55 is generated by this insurance, millions of dollars to be lost. And then I would ask that it is important to be able to have a rule structure, more than a structured rule, more than a closed rule, because the bills that are before us today, the underlying bills, I am opposed to, because my district is impacted by the Superfunds. I would ask that we have 50. Gentleman's very kind. The three Superfund bills, no involvement of the federal government, taking authority away from the federal government, having the states override the federal government on Superfunds. There are neighborhoods that are still suffering. And then, with respect to this issue of privacy, I support the idea. But what I would say to my friends, and this is a privacy with healthcare.gov, what I would say to my friends, we cannot continue to chip away at a bill, the Affordable Care Act, where millions of people have received health care. Let's work to ensure all of the privacy sites or the sites of the federal government. Let's not pick away at the Affordable Care Act, which has been documented that it is secure, healthcare.com. If the Republicans wish to help make all of the government secure, we're ready to do that. But what I would suggest is that this bill is not going in the right direction.
Gentlemen,
I, in fact, ask a no vote on the rule and on the underlying bills. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I tire of going through this history lesson every time we come down to the floor. But may I remind you, when the now Affordable Care Act was passed into law, this is a bill that came over to the House from the Senate. Now, sure enough, the House had sent the bill over to the Senate in July of 2009, H.R. 3590. It was a bill that dealt with housing. The bill that dealt with housing was amended. The amendment read, strike all after the enacting clause and insert, and the health care language, which was de novo, the health care language was inserted. Now, to be sure, the House had considered a health care reform bill, H.R. 3200. H.R. 3200 has gone to the ether of history. H.R. 3590 passed in the Senate, 60-vote margin on Christmas Eve 2009, and then was thrown over to the House of Representatives. Did we have a hearing on H.R. 3590 in the Committee on Energy and Commerce? No, we did not. Did they have a hearing in the appropriate subcommittee of Ways and Means on H.R. 3590 as amended? No, they did not. The bill came to the Rules Committee. It came to the Rules Committee. I attempted to offer amendments. I was told no thank you. The bill was perfect the way it is. Doesn't need any changes. This bill that affects every man, woman, and child in this country for the next 3 decades in a very unfavorable way was passed without any input from the then minority, the Republicans in the House of Representatives. So it is beyond comprehension that we could continue to have these arguments about closed processes. This, after all, is the granddaddy of all closed processes, and the consequence, the drafting errors, the problems embedded in the structure could not be dealt with during the normal legislative process, which is why so much authority has been transferred to the executive branch, to the agencies, and why they are now essentially writing the laws that affect so many Americans. I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague. I was listening as a student of history myself to our friend from Texas, and that little last bit about affordable health care, he left out one little piece of history, which was that the Republicans in both the Senate and the House, to a person, decided a priori to oppose the Health Care Reform Act, no matter what was in it. to now come back and say we weren't given an opportunity to amend something that we decided we were going to oppose. Remember Jim DeMint's words? If we can defeat this bill, it will be President Obama's Waterloo, no matter what's in it. So we need to remember history in its full context. And speaking of history, knowing of my distinguished friend's love of it, it was almost 35 years ago when the 96th Congress answered the cries of communities across the country facing the life-threatening effects of hazardous toxic waste. Who can forget, speaking of history, Love Canal disaster in New York or the Valley of the Drums in Kentucky, the unexplained increases in the incidence of cancer, birth defects, and miscarriages. In an overwhelmingly bipartisan effort then, that Congress did the right thing by creating the Superfund program, offering communities a way to remediate contaminated sites to protect public health and hold polluters accountable. The success of the Superfund is clear. According to the EPA, as of April of last year, remedial actions have been completed at more than 1,145 national priority list sites, and an additional 365 have been completely cleaned up and deleted from the list. That's called success. That's called a program that's working. That's 70% of the sites that had been added to the priority list. Today, human exposure is under control at 1,361 priority sites, and contaminated groundwater under control at 1,069 sites.
I'll yield an additional 30 seconds.
And yet, despite that success, with communities still in need, in process, the House majority wants to peel back that progress and repeal what we've done. Can the Superfund be approved? Of course. And we're committed to do that. But the answer isn't letting industry off the hook and leaving families exposed to hazardous waste and high cancer rates. I urge defeat of this bill, and I thank my colleague for giving me the extra time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Myself a minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I would point out that this bill before us today does not change the Superfund, but it does allow states the flexibility to deal with problems in their states as they see fit. And I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on this 50th anniversary of the war on poverty, 1.4 million Americans have lost emergency unemployment insurance, and thousands more stand to lose it each day, each week that Congress fails to act. If we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule that will allow the House to consider legislation that's identical to the bipartisan measure being considered in the Senate and would restore unemployment insurance to those who have lost it. To discuss our proposal, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, a leader in the effort to restore unemployment insurance, Mr. Kildee.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Polis, for the time. And I urge my colleagues to join me in defeating the previous question, as my colleague said, so that we can immediately take up the question of the extension of emergency unemployment to millions of Americans who have lost their job and who are seeking to find their next opportunity to contribute to our economy and to support their families. You know, I'm part of the freshman class. We just began our second year in Congress, and something about the 2012 class that I think defines us is that we believe that we were sent here by the electorate of 2012 not to posture but to get things done, to take action, to solve problems. And that's why myself and the rest of the Democratic freshman class yesterday sent a letter to Speaker Boehner asking that he immediately bring up an extension to the unemployment compensation for so many Americans. Let's be clear about something, though. Unlike what I have heard from so many on the other side, being unemployed is not a choice. It is not a lifestyle to be sought. It is a condition that is often unanticipated, and it is one that nobody in my district that I know of who's unemployed would ever seek to try to maintain. And I can only speak for the people I represent, but I suspect this is true of my colleagues. Folks that we represent back home that are out of work would gladly today trade unemployment compensation for a job. that puts them to work and gives them the dignity of work and the obligation to, or the ability to meet their obligations to their family and their community. It's about survival. It's about making your rent payment. It's about being able to pay your car payment, to put food on the table for your kids. It's about being able to keep the house warm. It's not a lifestyle to be sought. And I think the notion that somehow people who are unemployed want to be there is condescending and offensive. I urge my colleagues to join me in defeating this previous question so that we can immediately take up the work that the American people are asking us to take up. And
Gentleman's time's expired.
Help, if I could have an additional 30 seconds.
Yield an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
To make sure that 1.3 million Americans have a chance to support their families until they can find meaningful work. 11 million people since 2008 have been saved from poverty because of unemployment compensation. That unemployment extension was supported by the vast majority of members of this House, signed by President Bush, with no strings attached. What is different about 2014 than what was experienced in 2008? Nothing, except that we have the same obligation to those same Americans to make sure that they don't go broke, that they don't lose their house, that they don't lose their car, that they don't lose their family as a result of the lack of basic decency. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve my time.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate this opportunity to comment not only upon this rule, which provides, of course, for mostly closed rules, no amendments, no ability to change or modify, particularly 2 bills that had no hearings, went to no committees, and were reported out doing stuff that we did for 2013 almost without exception. But what I really rise to say is that I want to urge every member to vote against the previous question. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know the American public will hear previous question. What does that mean? The previous question, if defeated, will give us the opportunity to put on this floor what the overwhelming majority of American people want on this floor, which I understand the gentleman from Michigan, as I just was walking in, I think he was talking about. And that is to deal with the most pressing issue confronting this country right now, today. And that is that we have 1.3 million Americans who have simply been dropped through whatever safety net we thought we had constructed. Now, so, Mr. Speaker, the American public understands the previous question will give us the opportunity, if it's defeated, to put that legislation on the floor now, to extend for those 1.3 million people the help of the American people who want to do it. In every poll, they say, no, we ought to have this help. And when George W. Bush was President of the United States, 5 times we extended unemployment insurance for long-term unemployed, 5 times without paying for it. If the previous question is defeated, and make no mistake about it, the vote on the previous question is whether or not you want to give long-term unemployed who have lost their insurance and are having trouble putting food on their tables, if you want to give them help, you will vote no on the previous question. Don't hide behind a procedural issue. This is a substantive issue. This is an issue of whether we're going to give help now. So the American public that is for this ought to be looking at it, and every member who votes yes on the previous question is voting not to give help to those folks, 1.3 million of them, 20,000 veterans. Do you have any more time?
30 seconds, the gentleman.
Gentleman's recognized.
20,000 veterans who can't find a job, and there is only one job available for every three people that are looking for a job. That's why George W. Bush extended unemployment. That's why we ought to do it, and we can do it. We have the ability to do it. Vote no on the previous question. It is a substantive vote on whether or not you want to help the long-term unemployed who have lost, as of December 28, 3 days after Christmas, the season of giving and caring, whether you want to give them the unemployment insurance that they count on to feed themselves and their families and have their heads above water. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
I thank the gentleman for
For
yielding.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 12 days, nearly 1.4 million Americans have been cut off from their emergency unemployment benefits, and thousands more Americans will lose their benefits every week without congressional action. It is unforgivable that this Congress will adjourn tomorrow without addressing this crisis. Instead of offering a solution to extend emergency unemployment benefits, this rule does not allow us to address this critical issue of extending unemployment insurance immediately. The longer we wait to fix this problem, the more serious it becomes for the long-term unemployed and their families. Punishing unemployed Americans and their families who've been hit hard in this tough recession through no fault of their own is just plain wrong. My home senator, Senator Jack Reed, has offered a proposal in the Senate. It's a critical step in the right direction to preserve this critical lifeline while we work on a long-term solution, and we should do the same thing here. Surely, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want the opportunity to vote on extending unemployment insurance. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question, to defeat the previous question, so we can take up the issue of extending unemployment insurance for many Rhode Islanders and Americans all across this country who desperately need these benefits. Thank you, and I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I could inquire as to there are any other speakers on the other side. If not, I'm prepared to close.
I'm prepared to close.
I yield to the gentleman for closing.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. The Senate has passed a bipartisan comprehensive immigration bill. The Senate is debating unemployment insurance. Meanwhile, the House hasn't dedicated a single minute, a single second of legislative floor time to any immigration reform bill that would address identity theft. Let's move forward, pass bills that matter to the American people rather than political bills that aren't going anywhere. I urge a no vote on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the questions for people who've been watching this debate, I'm sure one of the questions that they have, is there any difference as to how the private sector is treated if and when a data breach occurs versus a federal agency? And the simple fact of the matter is there is a difference. Private sector is governed under state laws and, yes, some federal regulations as well. In fact, earlier this month in a publication called The Hill, titled Target's Data Breach Sparks Calls for Action, a significant discussion about perhaps more activity on the part of the Federal Trade Commission in protecting consumers who have been exposed to a data breach. Well, what are the protections for people harmed with a data breach by the federal government? Well, in fact, for that, there's not legislation, there's not a law that was signed by any administration, but there is an executive order of the President dating from May 22nd, 2007, a so-called OMB circular. The OMB circular dealing with data breaches under the section Timeliness of Notification reads, agencies should provide notification without unreasonable delay following the discovery of a breach consistent with the needs of law enforcement and national security, and any measures necessary for your agency to determine the scope of the breach and, if applicable, to restore the reasonable integrity of the computerized data system compromised. Decisions to delay notification should be made by the agency head. So you get the impression that this is perhaps a rather open-ended or diffuse or poorly defined timeliness for notification for our constituents who are harmed by a data breach by a federal agency. So that is one of the problems that we are here today to correct. Today's rule provides for the consideration of a critical jobs bill, critical security bills to clean up our environment and to protect Americans' personal data. I certainly want to thank Mr. Gardner, Mr. Terry, and Chairman Pitts for their thoughtful bills. I urge my colleagues to support both the rule and the underlying pieces of legislation. For that reason, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution and urge an aye vote on the previous question.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recognized.
On that, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of adoption. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House today has been considering the rule for debate that covers 3 bills. One is a bill that would give states more authority over Superfund hazardous waste cleanup sites. The other 2 bills deal with the health care law, including a bill that would oversee the website security of healthcare.gov. Those bills will get consideration. If the rule passes, will get consideration later on in the week. Democrats have all called for a previous question vote before the rule, and this is a 15-minute vote on the House floor. In Trenton, New Jersey today, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie apologized for the highway lane closures that apparently ordered by his aides as political retribution. 2 of his aides have lost their job over that. It's about 1 hour and 50 minutes, and we are showing that to you on C-SPAN 2. We'll also bring it to you later in our program schedule and on cspan.org as well. Back on Capitol Hill earlier today, we heard from both the Republican and Democratic leader. First up, Speaker John Boehner and his comments with reporters.
Morning, everyone. This week, the House will pass, will consider 2 bills to increase the transparency of the President's health care law. They would require the administration to disclose information on enrollment security with regard to the Obamacare exchanges. These measures are part of a broader effort to protect the American people from the consequences of this disastrous law. The President doesn't want anyone to see what's taking place with this law. But the millions of Americans being hurt by it, frankly, have a right to know. While we will continue to carry out this oversight obligation, our primary focus will continue to be jobs and the economy. You know, for every American that's out of work, it's a personal crisis for them and their family. That's why House Republicans have acted on dozens of bills to help our economy, to help create more jobs that are being blocked by the Democrat-controlled Senate. These bills would provide job training skills for the unemployed, ease regulations and mandates that are costing jobs, promote innovation and education, and create energy and infrastructure jobs, just to name a few. The President should call on the Senate to act on these bills. 1 month ago, I told the White House that another extension of temporary emergency unemployment benefits should be paid for, but should also do something to help get our economy moving and to create more jobs. The President has ignored that recommendation. Now, if he produces such a plan, I'll be happy to discuss it, but we're going to remain focused on creating jobs and putting Americans back to work. And lastly, I'd like to address the ongoing threat of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Precious blood was spilled and national treasure was expended, helping Iraqis remove a brutal dictator and repelling terrorist elements determined to stamp out human freedom and dignity. That progress is now threatened. In the case of Fallujah, it's been reversed. A status of forces agreement with Iraq should have been agreed to, and this administration failed to deliver. Starting with the President delegating his responsibilities to the Vice President, the administration has chosen to spend much of its time and energy trying to explain why having terrorists holding key terrain in the Middle East is not the President's problem. The United States has and will continue to have a vital national interest in Iraq. We must maintain a long-term commitment to a successful outcome there. And it's time that the President recognize this and get engaged.
There's been a letter that General Ice and Jim Jordan have sent over to the FBI director about the IRS, and they're alleging that they have been stonewalling this inquiry. Do you think that there has been a stonewalling by the FBI to keep the House from getting at what went wrong with the IRS last year? And is there an alternative path that you might suggest, or the current committee process the right way to go about investigating?
The administration has not been forthcoming with regard to the IRS investigation. Furthermore, they've not been forthcoming when it comes to the Benghazi investigation or Fast and Furious. These investigations by the House are continuing. And the administration can try to stonewall as much as they want, but these issues are not going to go away. The American people have a right to know the truth. And for the administration that came in 5 years ago promising to be the most transparent administration in history, they've got a very poor record.
What do you mean by saying the President should get engaged back in Iraq? Should the United States send troops back there? Can you be more specific about what you're looking for the administration to do?
Well, one, I think that the President himself ought to take a more active role in dealing with the issues in Iraq. Secondly, we need to get equipment to the Iraqis and other services that would help them battle this counterterrorism effort that they're attempting to do. There are things that we can do to help the Iraqis that do not involve putting U.S. troops on the ground.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday some Republicans said that you told them that you would soon be outlining some principles of immigration reform for the party. Can you give us an update?
Chairman Goodlatte has been working with the leaders over the course of the last year as we've listened to our members discuss this issue. And we thought it would be appropriate to outline standards, principles that would guide us in a common-sense, step-by-step approach to dealing with immigration. I would expect in the coming weeks we'll have those available.
Will that be in the form of legislation or just a memo?
Standards, principles. David.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, I just want to make sure, do you favor sending any U.S. troops back into Iraq?
I don't think that is called for at this point in time. But there is equipment and some services that will be very helpful to the Iraqis as they develop this counterterrorism strategy that is going to be necessary, especially in this urban environment in Fallujah.
Mr. Bader, wondering if you saw any of Governor Christie's press conference before you came on.
No, I wasn't fortunate enough to have that opportunity.
So let me ask you, he did apologize for the bridge scandal, and he said he fired his top aides and took responsibility. I'm just wondering if you think this response is sufficient, that he could continue to remain a top 2016 Republican candidate? Does he bear any responsibility, even though he said he didn't know anything, because this happened on his watch?
You'll have to ask him.
Mr. Speaker, your concerns about the dairy program have been well known over the years. You've made them known. Will there be no farm bill without an elimination of the Soviet-style aspects to the dairy program?
I have no illusions that the Soviet-style dairy program we have will continue. But let's not make it any worse by including supply management tools that really will make it worse. And I have fought off the supply management ideas for 23 years that I've been in Congress, and my position hasn't changed. And Mr. Peterson and others are well aware of it. Jake.
What are some of your principles for immigration reform?
You know, you've tried for a year. It's not going to work today either. When we have the principles, we'll get them to you.
Speaker Boehner, recently there's been a whole slew of retirements, a lot of moderates, folks like John Runyon, Gerlich, your good friend Tom Latham, McIntyre, Matheson on the Democratic side. What does that mean for Congress after these midterm elections, where a lot of folks think it's going to become even more partisan? What do you think about all these moderates retiring, and how will that affect your ability to cut deals?
Well, you know, every member has to come to a decision about their service here. And all the members that you've indicated, and frankly all those who've announced their retirement, frankly very good members who in most cases have a long career of public service. And certainly we're going to miss them. But you know, the voters in these districts will choose some replacements, and the country and the Congress will move ahead. Listen, we have a very divided country, and as a result, we have a very divided Congress. Members tend to reflect you know, the wishes of the majority of their district. And so we're in this era where, frankly, things are more partisan, things are more ideological, and what we have to do is we have to figure out where is the common ground. That's the key to what I try to do every day. Where's the common ground? There's not as much as there used to be, I'll grant you that.
Boehner, Speaker, on the dairy provisions, if the Farm Bill were to include the supply management portion, would you consider not bringing it to
I am confident that the conference report will not include supply management provisions for the dairy program.
Mr. Speaker, the tandem of leaders in the House and Senate have been together for 7 going on 8 years now. It's the longest run since the Senate had its leadership structure in place. Yet this past year has been one of the most unproductive in congressional history for various reasons. And I'm wondering, do you think that with you all together again for another year, there's any way to make it better?
I wish I had a good answer for you. We've got a very divided Congress. We have a divided country. You know, we know we've got long-term debt problems driven by entitlement programs that are unsustainable. Yet the President refuses and Democrats refuse to discuss changes to those programs unless Republicans are willing to raise taxes. We're not going to raise taxes. You can look down a whole host of issues, but at some point the President needs to stand up and lead. You know, I would expect we're going to see a bipartisan bill introduced today by Congressman Camp and Senator Baucus on trade promotion authority for the President. But I've made clear to the President that this can't pass unless there's bipartisan support for it. And this goes back months, and yet we've seen scant attention to this issue by the administration in terms of encouraging Democrat leaders and Democrat members to stand up and vote for it. Last one.
Mr. Boehner, on the unemployment situation, have you had any more direct conversations with the White House or with Senator Reid on a possible deal? And separately, you've stressed that these were temporary emergency benefits. Do you believe the emergency is over with unemployment now down to 7%?
Well, clearly the emergency isn't as bad as it was, but for those families that have lost their jobs and have been unable to find new jobs, it is a crisis for them. That's why the House, for the 3 years that I've been Speaker, has been focused on jobs and the economy. Because the real answer is to get Americans back to work. I have not talked with the President or Democrat leaders about this issue because I've laid out what needs to happen, and they've yet to come forward with any plan.
Remember that angle.
What do you do?
Speaker John Boehner from this morning on the House floor, this 15-minute vote, a previous question vote, as Democrats in their previous debate bringing up the issues of the Affordable Care Act, extending unemployment insurance benefits, and also immigration reform. The New York Times reports today that House Republicans hope to release their principles on immigration reform near the end of the month, before President Obama's State of the Union, as well as before their annual retreat. The issue of immigration reform and extending the unemployment benefits also came up in Nancy Pelosi's briefing. The Democratic leader spoke for about 25 minutes, and we'll show you what we can as this vote continues.
Good morning. Happy New Year. Hope you all had a beneficial holiday season, productive and relaxation. I always remind you, recreation is important. Recreate has the word recreate. We must renew ourselves, being with our families and friends, and being inspired by the holiday. So here we are, back in Washington. The first day of this week was part of the first week in 2014, when the Affordable Care Act came fully into effect. 9 million Americans now have quality health care coverage. 2.1 have enrolled in private coverage, 3.9 on Medicaid so far, and 3 million young adults now covered under their parents' plan. And, of course, the list will continue to grow. What's important about it is not only the quantity of people, but the quality of care. No one will be denied care and coverage because of a pre-existing medical condition. No one will face annual dollar limit or lifetime limits on their coverage. No one will go without because of basic services that would be denied them. Finally, being a woman is no longer a pre-existing medical condition. As you know, women were discriminated in the insurance marketplace. Not only is the ACA delivering peace of mind to millions, it's helping to deliver a historic slowdown in health care spending. A new report this week from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services found that from 2010 to 2012, health spending grew at the lowest rate in the 50 years we have been collecting this data. It went at the lowest rate of increase. This is quite remarkable. I should have another chart here showing you what the rate of growth was before the Affordable Care Act. Reining in health spending is not only good for the price of health care, it strengthens the economy by boosting employment, lowering deficit, and increasing wage growth as the job market expands. The Affordable Care Act is delivering a healthier future for the American people and the American economy. I focus on the cost issue because if there were no other reason to pass the Affordable Care Act, the unsustainability of the cost would be reason enough. Cost to individuals, to families, to small businesses, to corporate America, to the state, local, state, and federal budgets. And so the goal of reducing cost is now a reality coming into play. So that's one place we were in this first week in January. At the same time that 9 million Americans have quality health care coverage, and the number is growing, at the same time, House Republicans' obstruction has led 1.4 million Americans to lose their unemployment insurance. It's a stunning difference in values, a stunning difference in doing the job for the American people. 1.4 million have lost emergency unemployment insurance, people who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own, who work hard, play by the rules. Every week that we do not pass these benefits, 72,000 more Americans are cut off for unemployment insurance each week, that is. Yet House Republicans insist on holding unemployment insurance hostage to tax cuts for the wealthy, for their special interest friends. That's what they call a jobs program. It was the giveaways to corporations and the wealthy that got us into this fiscal situation in the first place. That approach of tax breaks to the high end and special interest won't help Americans being left out in the cold, suffering from being cut off from lifeline of unemployment benefits Men and women who've worked hard, again, played by the rules and lost their jobs through no fault of their own. Republicans are again choosing to leave these families out in the cold. Economists agree that unemployment benefits remain one of the best ways to reduce the deficit, to inject. This money is spent immediately. It's absolutely necessary, and it is spent on necessities immediately, injecting demand into the economy, creating jobs. And for every dollar spent on unemployment benefits, returns $1.52 to the economy. And failure to extend UI will result in the loss of 240,000 jobs over the next year. So again, it's not just about meeting the needs of people, which is an important responsibility we have. When it comes to the economy, it's very important to have this stimulus. Actually, food stamps and unemployment benefits, while we would like to create many more jobs to reduce the need for them, as it turns out, they are the fastest way to inject demand into the economy. Later today, House Republicans are going to have an opportunity to show the American people that their priorities, whether they will act to create jobs, restore a critical lifeline for hardworking Americans searching for a job, or insist on the ransom for the rich. Democrats will be offering a motion to have the House consider the same extension of emergency unemployment insurance that is advanced with bipartisan support in the Senate. So here we have, in this short period, the end of December, the beginning of January, the full implementation of the Affordable Care Act and all that brings to America's families, and a rejection of an extension of unemployment benefits and all that that means to America's working families. You know I love temple markers. I always put things in time. Yesterday marked the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's declaration of unconditional war on poverty. The initiatives born from the war on poverty, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and the permanent food stamp program have lifted millions of Americans out of poverty and onto ladders of opportunity. But today, too many Americans still, in the words of Lyndon Johnson, live on the outskirts of hope, struggling under stagnant wages, widening income inequality, and a growing deficit of opportunity. Poverty, unemployment, and income inequality, these are not just economic issues, they are moral ones. In a week when the House Republicans are demanding giveaways for big corporations and wealthy before they'll help those struggling to find a decent job, it's clear some people need reminding of that. During the 50th anniversary on the war on poverty, we look back and see great victories in that war that still need winning. It's time to act now. It's time to win the war on poverty. It's disappointing that the House Republicans are continuing their obsession with the Affordable Care Act in this new year instead of working with Democrats to strengthen our economy and create jobs. As I said earlier, more than 9 million Americans have found newfound health security in 2014 thanks to the Affordable Care Act, and millions more stand to gain from quality, affordable coverage, the coverage it provides. With that, I'd be pleased to take any questions you may. Yes.
You had an event yesterday with a lot of groups who were advocating this unemployment extension here, and of course, I think the pastor, Reverend Livingston, he talked about the process, and he's well, people who are hurting don't get the process here. My question is this: when it comes to the unemployment part, the Republicans are demanding these offsets right now. You have been through many a negotiation over the years here. If that, even though that's not what you want, and even that's what Harry Reid doesn't want, why not say, okay, we're not going to get anything if we don't give a partial loaf here, if we don't give something to have something partly covered or fully covered in this political climate?
The unemployment insurance benefit situation has always been considered an emergency. I think one time we did pay for it, but 3 times during the Bush administration. 3 times the unemployment insurance benefits were passed with no offsets. The fact is also that the Republicans are not just asking for pay-fors. They keep moving the goalpost, and we want job creation, a euphemism for tax breaks for the rich, and we want to end regulation, clean air, clean water, you name it. They want to simplify life for those who would exploit. So it's not just about the monetary offset. And the fact is, what would be useful is for us to be able to pass the 3-month extension and then talk about the larger issue of what we do for the next year. And in that case, you might be talking about an array of issues in relationship to the unemployment insurance. The Republicans have resisted. What we had in our budget was short-term job creation, build the infrastructure of America, longer-term early childhood learning, which is really an important part of the economic growth of our country. They've rejected all of that, and they just want to go back to the same policies that produce the deficits that we have now. These unemployment insurance had been paid into. So, again, at the end of the day, we want to have the extension of the benefits. We haven't seen anything come forward from the Republicans as to pay-fors where they would say, we would support this bill if you have this pay-for. Yesterday they proposed one that would take affordable tax, the low-income tax credit away from 4 children from immigrant families. I don't think that's a place that we can go. And this is all happening within the context of why are we not moving to raise the minimum wage, extend these benefits? Why are we talking about Republicans who have put forth a proposal to cut $40 billion from food stamps? And by the way, 97% of the Republican caucus voted for that. 15, not 15%, 15 members on the Republican side voted against that. 97% of them voted to cut $40 billion. So we have a values debate here as to what are our budget resources, what is the statement of our values, and why is it that these people have to pay, in terms of our responsibility to the American people, that they're practically paying twice because you pay in to unemployment insurance and now take it out of something else.
226, and the nays are 191. This question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Colorado.
on that I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
This is the rule vote covering 3 bills. One they'll debate today that would expand state responsibility in cleaning up Superfund hazardous waste sites. The other 2 bills will be on the House floor tomorrow and the end of the week. Those bills will deal with healthcare.gov, the healthcare website. One would let states, one would call for the enrollment numbers to be made public weekly, and the other would deal with the website's security. This is a 5-minute vote, and again, debate on that Superfund bill is expected once the rule passes. Meanwhile, over in the Senate, they are expected to gavel back in about 20 minutes at 2:15 Eastern. They have yet to formally begin debate on the bill extending unemployment insurance benefits, which expired in December. That vote is possible this afternoon. Meanwhile, CQ says that 3 of the 6 Republican senators who voted initially with the chamber's Democrats to begin the process on that bill now say they won't vote for cloture unless the cost of the measure is fully offset. Rob Portman of Ohio, Dan Coates of Indiana, and Kelly A. out of New Hampshire are pushing their own offsets to pay for the $6.4 billion price of that 3-month extension. The Senate expects again to gavel in about 2:15 Eastern, and that, of course, on C-SPAN 2.
On this vote, the yeas are 223 and the nays are 186. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The chair lays before the House an enrolled bill.
H.R. 667, an act to redesignate the Dryden Flight Research Center as the Neil A. Armstrong Flight Research Center and the Western Aeronautical Test Range as the Hugh L. Dryden Aeronautical